Welcome to I'm Too Busy, an interview-based show hosted by a talented makeup artist, Christina Flach. Christina offers viewers a unique blend of personal stories, inspiring journeys, and practical beauty tips. Join the conversation as Christina features successful individuals from various industries who share their insights on health, wellness, makeup, and the keys to their success. So now, please welcome the host of I'm Too Busy, Christina Flach.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of I'm Too Busy TV, where we dive into the lives of aspiring entrepreneurs and industry professionals who are making waves despite their packed schedules. I am your host, Christina Flach, and today I am so excited to have a very special guest who's transforming our understanding of law, race, and fashion through his groundbreaking scholarship and public engagement. Please join me in welcoming Richard Thompson Ford. Hello, how are you?
I'm doing great. How are you?
I'm fine, thank you. Thank you for being here today. I'm very honored. You have accomplished so much in your life. It's just incredible. So tell me, your work spans academic scholarships and public writing. What motivated you to bring these two worlds together?
Well, I had always been interested in reaching broad audiences as well as specialized audiences. And so even early in my career, I was interested in writing for opinion pieces for the popular press. And I've also always been interested in popular culture. And so it was just kind of a natural fit to try to bring some of my work on law and also on popular culture to a popular audience.
Did you always know you wanted to go into law?
No, I didn't. Actually, I only discovered my real interest for law probably my junior year of college. I took a few law school courses that were available to undergraduates and really loved all of them. And at that point thought, well, maybe this is a career for me, and the rest just kind of followed naturally.
So when you started, you went to law school and you got out, what was your career looking like then? What did you do?
Right after I got out of law school, I practiced at a large San Francisco law firm for about 2 years and did a variety of types of legal work, mainly business litigation.
Mhm.
But I also had an interest in entertainment law. At one point, I thought I might be, like a lawyer to the stars or lawyer to, musicians that I admired or something like that. But I got the opportunity then to explore my scholarly interest, which had really been building throughout the time I was in law school. And I got the chance to go back to Harvard to do a fellowship that would allow me to just write and research. And it didn't pay very much. It was a fraction of what I was making as a lawyer. But the idea that I could get paid anything to just pursue my own writing was so attractive that I took it and I moved back to Cambridge, Massachusetts, and worked on what turned out to be my first law review article.
Wow. And how long were you there?
So I was there for another 2 years. And the whole time I spent researching and writing, kind of learning how to be a scholar, talking to people at the law school and at other departments. And, a lot of time alone in a library back when people used to, everything was on paper. And so
Right.
you had to go to the actual library and physically pick up a book in order to get information.
So what happened after that?
So after that, I went on the market to get a teaching job and went all over the country talking to different law schools. It's funny, when I was first asked by my mother, well, if you got your dream school, what would it be? I said Stanford. I went to Stanford as an undergraduate. I love the Bay Area. I think, if
Right.
I could get back to California and do this out here at Stanford, it would be great. But my advisor said, if you were holding out for a job at Stanford, we're going to tell you to go back into private practice. The odds of that happening are not great. It's a hard, school to get. So
Right.
just be open. And as things turned out, I did get that offer from Stanford. And I've been at Stanford ever since. I visited at other schools, but this has been my home since the mid 1990s.
Wow. And so how many classes are you teaching there presently?
Right now, I teach three classes a year, and one class I teach to undergraduates. It's a seminar I call Law and Inequality, and it explores the variety of ways that law can help to fight inequalities, and also some ways that the law might make inequalities worse. But it's for undergraduates, and then at the law school, I kind of rotate through a few courses. I teach constitutional law, particularly focused on the 14th Amendment, which is the part of the Constitution that deals most directly with questions of equality. I teach an employment discrimination class. I teach a class on modern legal thought, which is sort of a law and philosophy class. And then sometimes I will teach other classes as needed.
That must be so stimulating for you
It
to
is.
be engaging with these students still. Do you miss being in private practice?
I occasionally miss the energy of preparing for a trial and the kind of immediate effect that one can have on people's lives through successful legal practice. You know, whether it's helping broker a deal, or it's being involved in litigation and vindicating someone's rights. But I love being in academia. You're working with young students who are starting off on their careers and interested and open-minded, as well as being able to do research that I find personally interesting and important. It's a real privilege.
Tell me a few stories of any of your students, you don't have to say their names, that have just been like memorable to you.
Oh, wow. There are quite a few. Um, One of my students who, when you get a student at the beginning of their career, they're exploring and they're grappling with issues. And I can think of more than one, but one in particular is coming to mind who, was just trying to figure out where she wanted to take her interests and is now a law professor at one of the top law schools in the United States, and is doing work that I couldn't have imagined, for myself, much less for one of my students, transforming the world in important ways. I have several students that are doing things in government, in academia, and in private practice that really are remarkable. And, so I feel some small amount of pride that I had a little bit of influence, perhaps, over what they've ultimately achieved.
You've clearly inspired them. It must be so gratifying.
It is. I mean, it's gratifying to teach students and see them learn. It's one of the real privileges of the job is to see that kind of light bulb go on over someone's head while you're describing something. I mean, just a couple days ago, I was in my office with a student, and I had been explaining some concept in class that I felt was fairly, mundane. And, he came into my office and said, "You just blew my mind when you said that. You put together these things that I've been trying to figure out." And, I thought, well, that's worth everything to think that you could take someone who's struggling with a set of issues and help them to, move their thinking to the next level.
Right, or get some clarity that they didn't have.
Yeah.
So your latest book, Dress Codes, explores the intersection of fashion and law. What sparked your interest in this particular subject?
Oh, well, there are two reasons. One's professional and one's personal. The professional reason is that there are a lot of disputes involving clothing and grooming codes and dress codes in American law. There are workplace dress codes that are challenged by employees as either a form of race discrimination, a form of sex discrimination, a type of religious intolerance. There are dress codes in high school that are challenged by students as a restriction on their rights to free speech or as just plain uptight. There's wide disparities in enforcement in high school dress codes. Most of it's directed at girls, and that raises equality issues. And one of the things I found in reading the legal literature and the case law was that when the courts would address some of these disputes, they did so in a way that I always found unsatisfying.
And
It
so,
seemed as if, yeah, well, it seemed as if the typical reproach was to say fashion and dress are trivial, and for the most part would be beneath the attention of the law, but perhaps they've touched on some important value like race or sex discrimination or First Amendment concerns. Um, but by beginning the analysis by saying that what the people were arguing about is basically trivial, it seemed to me that they missed a lot of the point of these disputes. And so, in many ways, the analyses were somewhat unsatisfying. And I think sometimes the courts missed a lot of what was important and sometimes came to the wrong conclusions. So I wanted to look at why clothing and fashion is important to people, so much so that they would sue about it, that employees would risk losing a job, that employers would risk losing a good employee, that people would lose time at school, and that schools would send students home that they had an obligation to teach over what they were wearing. So that was the professional reason. Personal reason is that I've always been kind of interested in fashion. It's been a way for me to, not only express myself, but kind of navigate the world and deal with sometimes new or difficult social environments that, clothing seemed important to me. I think I learned that from my father, who was the first African American in many circumstances that he found himself in his professional career. And he always took great pride in his appearance and his dress. And it was clear that he thought it was important more than just as a matter of vanity, but as a matter of dignity.
agree.
And that stuck with me.
And what does your father do?
Well, he's no longer with us, but he used to be the dean of the School of Health and Social Work at Cal State Fresno,
Oh, wow.
and he was the first black administrator at that school. And we moved from New York to California for that job, and he held that position for many years.
That's incredible. I personally feel like with dress, I mean, and I'm a makeup artist in my other world besides doing this, but I always feel that you should always try and look your personal best.
Mhm.
Whether, regardless of the situation. I just think it's less distracting when you feel that you look and are dressed appropriately because you can just focus on like what we're discussing right now, other than, oh my God, do I have syrup in my
Right.
eyes? Is my shirt like, am I in pajamas? And I also do think it is a form of respect to you that I come, to meeting with you or whomever looking like the best version of myself. I mean, don't you think that's important? Because I know in the tech world, there's CEOs that
Mhm.
wear t-shirts and flip-flops and that set the tone for the industry that, women wearing, I'm quoting you here, women wearing fashionable dresses or high heels face ridicule in the tech world. And some venture capitalists refuse to invest in a company run by someone wearing a suit. Do you find that to
Mhm.
be really true?
Yes, yes. There was a quote from the entrepreneur Peter Thiel, who's kind of famous now as a conservative political activist as well. But he was a big deal in the tech world and once said, "Never invest in a company where the CEO wears a suit." When Marissa Mayer, who was the CEO of Yahoo, appeared in a Vogue fashion spread, she was ridiculed. And one person said, and I think this kind of encapsulates the attitude, she looks like she's on vacation or going to a party while everyone else is working. So her fashionable clothing was seen as distracting from her work ethic almost that demonstrated that she was superficial and everyone else is working while she's out worried about what she's going to wear.
But I mean, don't you find that discriminatory as well?
I
I mean, I find that offensive, because I do work in the fashion world as well. And it's like, why is someone making that presumption that because someone dresses well, that they have a poor work ethic? I mean, if you would look at it from a different perspective, someone wearing a t-shirt and flip-flops would look like they're on holiday, right?
Yes, no, absolutely. That's what's so ironic about it, that this dressed down aesthetic has come to symbolize the work ethic in Silicon Valley. So, I mean, Mark Zuckerberg once said, the reason I wear a gray t-shirt, I'm paraphrasing, but the reason I wear a gray t-shirt is because if I wasted time on trivial things like what to wear, I wouldn't be doing my job, to make Facebook the best company it can be. And so right there, now the t-shirt's not a matter of indifference. He didn't say, who cares what I'm wearing? What's important is the quality of my work. Instead, the t-shirt became a symbol of the work ethic. And so it's just a new dress code, in a different form. But I do think that it has implications for gender equality because that kind of dressed down aesthetic really works best for men. And women, I think, struggle with that. So, on the one hand, if they dress up too much, they're going to be ridiculed as vain and superficial. But if they don't, I don't think they're going to get the same benefit of the doubt that a man does wearing a t-shirt and flip-flops.
I completely agree. On a separate note, I was hired by Fox to do the grooming for Mark Zuckerberg, Dana Perino and Tucker Carlson, and he declined my services. And I'm like,
Hmm.
I'm getting paid, okay? You're not. So it for me, it was also
Yeah.
kind of weird. Like I'm hired to do my job, and you're declining, even though I'm just gonna make you look a little bit better. So
Right.
I found that kind of offensive, actually.
Yeah. And it's kind of it's really surprising as well because the way you look on the camera is very different than the way you look in person. When I first had my big TV, my first like TV appearance where I was actually in front of like lots of lights and cameras, and they had someone come in to make me up and said a lot of people look washed out on camera. And I said, well, I don't think that's going to be my problem. But she said, "Trust me, for sure, like in the absence of that, every tiny imperfection shows up, every wrinkle, every weird thing.
Right.
Um, it's a real skill you have."
It really, well, and it's also when you're doing the grooming for a man on TV, a good groomer, and I consider myself one, no one would even know you have anything on. You just
Right.
look
Yes.
like a little bit fresher and
Mhm.
not shiny and just a better version of you.
Yeah.
So speaking of your television appearances, you've appeared on the Colbert Report. How do you translate complex legal concepts for broader audiences?
Yeah, that is a challenge. And it's one of the things that I've spent a lot of time thinking about. The Colbert Report was the first big television show I was on, and I was just as nervous as you could possibly be. But I'd gotten a lot of advice from people who'd either watched it or been on the show about one, keeping your answers short, having that kind of elevator pitch statement of your idea. That's hard for academics to do. We're used to having a captive audience for an hour where, we can go on and on. No, you need to have something very short so that people don't turn off the television. And so that's one thing. I found telling stories is a great way to translate complicated ideas to a general audience. Um, and if I can find a good story that illustrates my point, then I don't have to spend very much time explaining it in abstract terms that start to become boring.
So you were also a featured TED Talk speaker, and you've appeared on the Rachel Maddow show, and you've been a former host on SiriusXM Stanford Legal. Tell me about that. Did you enjoy that? Did you find that to be something that came naturally, or did you kind of have to learn how to, you know, speak to people in a different way? I mean, you mentioned earlier that you have to be a little more concise with your answers, but what else
Yes.
did you learn about being on these shows?
Oh, yeah.
Maybe how you teach your courses.
Oh, actually, yes. I think it has affected the way I teach my courses. And the TED in particular puts you through a very rigorous training before you give the TED Talk. And so what's interesting is that these TED Talks look like they're someone just having a conversation, but in fact, they're really, really, really well rehearsed. They're really well thought out. Down to, the seconds of time. Like, your talk is going to be 9 minutes and 32 seconds. And here's how you're going to make these transitions. And so it taught me a lot about precision and the way small differences can make the difference between, keeping your audience and losing their attention. They were great at coaching me on how to pack a complicated set of ideas into a very short period of time. So, they're like, you've got 10 minutes, no more. How do you get your point across in 10 minutes? So that was a great experience. Um, it's a little different on a podcast like Stanford Legal where we have a bit more time, but a lot of the same things apply. A lot's about trying to be more concise and find ways to tell a compelling story that will grab read or listeners' attention right away. So yeah, I think I have brought that to the classroom in a variety of ways. I'd like to think that my lecturing style and my teaching style is more engaging as a result.
Oh, I'm sure it's done nothing but help, but I'm sure you were amazing regardless. You've written extensively about race and the law. How has your perspective evolved throughout your career?
Well, in a few ways, I my earliest work about race and the law was designed to get at how things that we overlook can cause racial inequalities. So rather than looking at the, stereotypical bigot who's deliberately trying to keep people of color down or something like that, wanted to look at the way things like local government boundaries, things like the way government operates differently in different neighborhoods can reproduce racial inequalities. Um, and I guess that work got me thinking more about how questions of race discrimination are often not simple. We like to tell, a simple story of a racist who is a morally evil person and deserves condemnation. And, those people are out there, don't get me wrong.
Right.
But a lot of what we're experiencing now doesn't involve that. It involves people who are you know, decent people whose activities are just thoughtless with respect to questions of social equality, and or people who are in tough circumstances and are perpetuating racial equality because they're really busy trying to focus on something else that's also important. So they're trade-offs. And I guess that's the way that has affected my thinking about it, is to see these things as more complicated and a little less black and white, if you will, than I may have thought at one time.
Can you tell me a little about the research process behind dress codes and what surprised you along the way? And I love this
Yeah.
quote from your book. One can make a gentleman from 2 yards of red cloth.
Yes, right. Cosimo de' Medici, the great patriarch of Florence during the Renaissance, said this, and it reflected the idea and an anxiety that people were dressing above their station, and that in a society where a lot was communicated visually, the ability to look like an aristocrat, to look like a gentleman, often was all there was to it. And so there was a worry about changing social hierarchy and the power of fashion to affect those social hierarchies. The You were asking about the research process, and I mean, it's the most fun I've had doing any writing project. But I spent a lot of time digging through history articles and books and going into archives, trying to find examples of legal rules around clothing. Because I thought, well, I'm a lawyer, and the way I can get at this is by looking at what laws were in place at the time. And I guess what surprised me is how many of them there were. I'm yet expected to find a few, but there were a vast number of rules and regulations from the late Middle Ages through about the early 1600s about dress, regulating it in great detail. And so this was not a small thing. It wasn't an isolated thing. It was something where, in like a single year, there could be two, three, four acts of apparel that were attempting to regulate clothing. There were law enforcement campaigns that involved, people with lists of citizens or subjects at that time. They wouldn't have been citizens, according to their social rank, to make sure that no one was wearing clothing that was above their station. Elaborate enforcement. It was quite surprising to me and really fascinating.
This is so interesting. I have never thought about this from this perspective at all. And to go back in time in history to think that this was such an issue is really remarkable to me. How far back did you go historically?
Well, the book really begins in the late Middle Ages, and that's a moment. I talk a tiny bit about the ancient world, but only in order to contrast this moment in the late Middle Ages, 1300s, that some historians describe as the birth of fashion. And that's when clothing really begins to get varied and expressive. You get tailoring techniques that create like bold shapes, big collars with big ruffs, or puffy sleeves or puffy trousers, things that really become an art form. And that leads fashion to become a new kind of status symbol, but also a new way of exercising political power. And so, Queen Elizabeth, for instance, a lot of her clothing was designed to convey royal authority. People said that she almost looked otherworldly. And that was by design. And it was an important part of the way she exercised power and asserted her right to rule. So that's that birth of fashion as a way of conveying that kind of meaning that we're really familiar with today, but wasn't always true. That's where I started, and then and that's right when these laws started as well, beginning to regulate what people could wear according to their social rank. And then I moved forward into the present.
So could you tell me, and I don't know if this is what you can quote me on here, but what was like the first law? Like who went to somewhere and decided we're going to make a law about fashion and about what people are wearing and their rank and where they are in the world? I can't even imagine that happening.
Yes. So this started, I think one of the first ones was actually in the late 1200s.
Really,
But they really got going in the 1300s and kind of kept accelerating all the way through the 1500s. And the first laws were designed to control consumption, and in particular, conspicuous consumption, according to wealth. So you had concerns that people were buying things they couldn't afford. You had concerns that people were buying foreign products that were going to contribute to, a negative trade balance for various regimes. But most of all, you had the concern that people were dressing above their station, putting on airs, taking on the pretense to be of a higher social rank and importance than they, really were, according to the hierarchies of the time. And it became really clear that that was the biggest concern, that these kind of things coincided with economic booms where skilled tradespeople and merchants were making a lot of money. So now suddenly they could afford fancy and luxurious clothing. And they looked around at the aristocrats and said, well, if it's good for them, maybe it's good for us as well. But they were kind of a new social class that was asserting itself, kind of flexing their muscles. Not so much that they wanted to pass themselves off as aristocrats, but maybe what was more subversive to say, we're just as important as aristocrats. We deserve this fine clothing as well. And I think that was really threatening.
It's so funny. It seems like the government was very involved,
Yes.
and that's really surprising to me.
Yes, the government was very involved. Some of these laws involved the church and were regulations on modesty. So those were often directed primarily at women, although not always, but a requirement that people behave modestly and therefore not adorn themselves with vanities. But a lot of them were from royal courts. I mean, again, Henry VIII, and then even more so Queen Elizabeth I in England passed a lot of acts of apparel or proclamations. Parliament passed acts of apparel and were involved with the concern that people were acting above their rank, and it was confusing to the general population and threatened to overturn the appropriate established order. These arguments were made openly. So one of the things that was great for me as a scholar about reading about these early laws is that people were quite upfront about the fact that, we have a hierarchy, it needs to be maintained. It's not acceptable for people of lower orders to dress in the way that's appropriate for people of higher orders. We don't say that anymore today, even though we sometimes act like it. But back then, they were perfectly fine with saying it.
So what would happen if someone was convicted of such a crime back then? Like what would happen?
The penalties. One person, well, one of the main penalties that you see is that they'd have the offending clothing seized by the government. So you're not supposed to have that. We're going to take it. Public humiliation was a common penalty. One person, for instance, was arrested on the streets of London for wearing what the authorities described as a monstrous and outrageous pair of trunk hose. And trunk hose are these big puffy trousers that you might associate with, Sir Walter Raleigh or William Shakespeare. They were big men's fashion, and they could get very big and puffed up, and that was the fashion for the elite. So this person who was a tailor or a tailor's apprentice had these trunk hose and was arrested, and the linings of his trunk hose were torn out by ripped out while he was wearing them. And then he was marched through the streets of London with the lining trailing behind him for all to see, back to his place of residence where the constables searched and found other offending garments that were likewise torn in front of him. So that was one example. Another person had his offending garment seized and then posted in a public place
Oh my God.
um, as an example for everyone of his extreme folly. So, and then there were also monetary fines.
Wow. So between the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries, has it changed these laws, or what was different in those previous centuries?
Yeah, the laws kind of fell out of favor around the 1600s, and by the 1700s, most had either been repealed or simply were no longer enforced. Part of the reason this happened was that as fashion continued to mature and advance, it became harder and harder for authorities to list the things that would convey high status. Fashion's just changing too quickly. In fact, at one point in the late 1500s, the Venetian Senate passed a law that simply said all new fashions are hereby banned. Because they clearly had been racing to catch up with the latest fashion, and now we have to ban this, now we have to regulate that. So they just let's put an end to all this. But of course, that didn't work. And so status started to change. It started to change from something that was conveyed through flashy and ostentatious display to something that was conveyed through subtleties. So by the time of, let's say, Beau Brummel in the early 1800s in England, in Regency era England, he's the avatar of masculine vanity, but he was known for his understatedness. That he didn't wear flashy clothing. Everything was subtle and subdued, but all of the details had to be perfect. And so this new way of exhibiting fashion was something that didn't require the same type of overt regulation, but served some of the same functions. And you can read in periods of the time, like kind of handbooks that will advise about all the variety of details that the well-dressed gentleman or the fashionable lady would wear. And it gets quite elaborate. You wear this in the afternoon and this for tea and this in the evening, and you have to have 5 different outfits, but they have to be of the appropriate cloth and cut and everything else. So it was about know-how rather than about just money.
Did you find most of these laws applied more to men or women?
The early laws applied to both men and women, although it was really men who had the most fashionable clothing up until sometime like the late 1700s. All of the new innovations were masculine and women borrowed them. All of the sexiest fashions were masculine. Women, for instance, were all required to be draped below the waist, whereas men had, stockings that showed off their legs and things like that. And it was understood to be very sexy. But that changed in the 1700s. And then it was women who were fashionable and men were just well dressed. And so you had this stark shift in the way people thought about fashion. Now, it doesn't mean that men didn't care about the way they looked, but they didn't want to be seen as fashionable anymore. That was frivolous. Now we're just well dressed. And so the rules then started to apply more to women as well. The women needed to have five different outfits during the day, if they were wealthy, of course, and lots of elaborate things. But for men, the rules were often unstated, but very important. The importance of a suit that's well cut, that fits properly, that's of the right refined fabric. Those things became extremely important, and anyone who knew would be able to tell the difference between, the well-dressed gentleman in a well-fitted suit and the, upstart, or the wannabe wearing a poorly fitted suit or wearing the wrong thing at the wrong time.
So was color ever a factor in the fabric?
Yes, the color. At the time when men started to kind of renounce the flashier fashions, and one historian described this as the great masculine renunciation, where men cast off all of that. The colors became much more subdued, and so first it was grays and beige type colors, subdued, but still somewhat colorful, perhaps with a colorful waistcoat. Over time, this matured into the Brooks Brothers style business suit. And the typical man was wearing this very somber outfit that kind of conveyed practicality and civic virtue and a lack of vanity. So there's kind of a direct line between that shift to dark colors and to, Mark Zuckerberg's gray t-shirt. The same message is being conveyed. I have better things to think about than what I wear.
So what about in the last 100 years? Has any of these issues legal from a legal perspective arisen?
Yes, there are still a variety of ways in which fashion and law intersect. In the early 20th century, for instance, it was still unlawful in many American and European cities for women to wear pants. That was considered to be indecent. Um, yeah, early 20th century, there were lots of workplace dress codes prohibiting women from, for instance, showing their legs or showing their ankles. When the flapper fashions began to become popular in the 1920s, one of the things that was most scandalous about them was that the skirts were, for that period of time, short in the sense that they were, just below the knee so that the entire leg could be showing. And that was seen as a huge scandal and a provocation. The outfits were form-fitting rather than big draped skirts, and that again was seen as quite provocative. Some condemned it as not feminine enough, some as too sexy, but either way, people didn't like it, and employers passed rules prohibiting women from wearing these kind of. Right. Your question was whether we had any of these rules about clothing in the 20th century. So yeah, where should I pick it up?
Go right there. Just start right there if you want to say that again.
Okay. So we do still have rules about clothing even in the 20th century. For example, in the early 20th century, women could be arrested in some American and European cities for wearing pants. and not tight pants or see-through trousers or anything, but just regular men's clothing was seen as a real provocation. Um, Clothing that showed a woman's legs was considered quite scandalous, and employers, for instance, passed laws against what were described as flapper fashions, which included the newly, for the time, short skirts. They were still cut below the knee, but that showed the woman's legs, and that was a new thing and one considered to be quite provocative. Women, of course, many women liked these fashions, and the fashions managed to proliferate despite these rules. But there was a long period of time in which people suggested that women wearing flapper fashions should be subject to arrest for indecent exposure, that they were inviting sexual assault, and therefore had no cause to complain if they were assaulted, given that they were dressed like this. All kinds of ideas, and of course, again, employers that outlawed the fashions is scandalous. Um, and then, as you move through the 20th century, public indecency laws were used for people who cross-dressed. So, now one of the
I was
first
going to ask
examples was
about
just
that, if that was ever an
uh,
issue in historic, history.
yes, yes. So, I mean, one of the earlier examples were women wearing trousers was considered, kind of a form of cross-dressing. That was a masculine style.
Right.
And it was seen as sexually provocative. If you think of like Marlene Dietrich in Morocco with the
Right.
tuxedo, that's a sexy thing. And that's the way people looked at women wearing pants at that period of time, because it suggested the woman was going to assert the social prerogatives of men. And that, meant a certain sexual openness that women weren't expected to exhibit, lack of modesty. But cross-dressing then, later, of course, involved more concern about men dressing in women's clothing and laws prohibiting cross-dressing, usually under the rubric of indecent exposure or public indecency, continued in the United States through the 1970s. Yes, through the night, people, in fact, there was some litigation around these laws in the 1970s where they were eventually challenged as, interestingly, unconstitutionally vague. So the reason that they were objectionable is because they were too vague. One court said, we don't, given the change in fashions, how do we know what's a masculine fashion and what's a feminine one? Men were wearing, kind of the romantic look with the ruffled shirts and
Right.
things like that. And so the court said, well, how will is that a woman's blouse and subjects you to arrest for indecency, or is that a man's fashion? We can't tell. So this law is too vague to be enforced. And they kind of then fell into, were either invalidated or just no longer enforced. But that was quite recent, even as recently as the early 21st century. And maybe even today, there are laws about that have been used about sagging pants, the kind of hip hop style.
Oh,
And
right.
again, prosecuted as public indecency. You're showing your undergarments. That's the official reason for arresting people. One person wearing sagging pants was actually thrown in jail for contempt of court, because the judge found it contemptuous that someone would come into his courtroom wearing sagging pants. So we still have
Find
some of
that to
these
be
laws.
like indecent, like almost like indecent exposure, or how would
Yes.
one determine?
Yes. Well, that's just it. The claim is that it's indecent exposure because you're wearing these pants that show your underwear. Um, I think realistically, the objections had more to do with the African American subculture that that style is associated with. But a lot of people felt that it conveyed a lack of respect. And, it's worth noting, there were many African Americans who objected to the sagging pants too. There was a whole group of, almost a little movement in the early 2000s that was kind of called "Pull Up Your Pants," get a belt. buy a belt. So people, and these were sometimes, African American churches, African American leaders saying, "Hey, pull up your pants, show some respect." So um, that dovetailed with the enforcement, the legal enforcement in with some of these public indecency laws.
To date. So is there anything in the last 50 years of any laws or any legal cases that one would say have affected fashion or that someone's getting persecuted or something, not persecuted, but getting and having an issue with the law because of
Uh,
clothes?
well, yes. I mean, other than the sagging pants cases, which were recent, all braided hairstyles were a subject of legal disputes since way back in the 1970s. There was a woman who was a flight airline, I believe, a flight attendant who had an all braided hairstyle, and the airlines had a lot of rules about how the flight attendants could dress, and said that that was not consistent with the dress code, and she sued for race discrimination. Now she lost that case, but the conflicts involving all braided hairstyles continued, and now we're beginning to see legislation that prohibits employers from forbidding all braided hairstyles. They're called the Crown Act. California and several other states have adopted it, but not every state. And so there are still workplaces where locks or braids are prohibited by the employer, and they lead to legal conflicts as to whether or not those rules are either discrimination or sex discrimination or both.
I'm going to switch to other subjects, but is there anything else that I've missed that you want to share about your book or, going back in history from a legal perspective with fashion?
Oh, there's so many interesting incidents involving the complexities of the way fashion signifies things, from dignified dress for African Americans to the variety of ways in which women have struggled with gendered expectations around clothing. And maybe the biggest theme is that it's kind of that it's complicated in the sense that sometimes women embrace traditional femininity and feminine fashions, and sometimes they resist them. And similarly with African Americans, there's a whole history in the civil rights movement of wearing one's Sunday best to protest unjust laws. Today, that might seem strange, but at the time, it was a powerful symbol of a demand for racial dignity. So, looking back in history allows us to get a different perspective on a lot of, or a variety of perspectives on the way that fashion signifies and why it's important to so many people.
Are there any other cultures besides African American cultures that have been affected by these laws?
Yes, yes, there are. In fact, the 1940s in Los Angeles, there were zoot suit riots, and the zoot suits were it was a fashion style that was worn in some places by African Americans, in some places by Italian Americans, but in Los Angeles by Latinos. And the Latino community embraced a certain subculture of the Latino community. It wasn't everyone, but embraced this style of, the kind of baggy trousers, long coats, and they were seen as insolent and unpatriotic, and got into fights with American servicemen who had been, stationed in Los Angeles. And there were a series of these Zoot Suit riots in which the servicemen and the Zoot Suiters fought, and when the servicemen won, they would take the Zoot Suits and burn them on a pyre. They raged for several days. People suggested legislation. One California politician said, if we can arrest people for being underdressed, we can arrest them for being overdressed. So we should pass a law against the zoot suits and these crazy styles. So that's another ethnic group that had been targeted. Chinese Americans had at times been targeted for the braids that some used to wear in, let's see, the 1800s, and that was, outlawed as a way to target that population.
Wow, that is amazing. I didn't realize the zoot suit was such a scandalous form of fashion.
Yes, yes.
Really interesting. So, what does being named one of the 100 most influential Black lawyers mean to you professionally and personally?
Oh, yeah, thank you. Well, it's a great honor. I have tried throughout my career to do work that's important, and at times it has been unusual work. I mean, a book about fashion, for instance. But a lot of my work has taken a somewhat unconventional tact at looking at issues involving race and race discrimination. And so it's really gratifying to have that work recognized.
Oh, that's such an accomplishment. How do you manage to balance your responsibilities as a professor, an author, a media personality, and board member of multiple organizations?
I try to keep a careful Apple calendar, and I try to prioritize. The thing that I focus on most is to ask each day, what's the most important thing that I can do today? What will have the most impact? And where can I make the biggest difference? Those are two questions because sometimes there's an activity that a lot of other people could do. I could do it, but I'm not uniquely qualified or needed, and that may take a lower priority than something where I think, if I don't do this, no one else will.
Correct. So, what do you do when your day isn't flowing? Because we all have
Well,
those days, right?
oh, absolutely. Well, I mean, I probably like most people, sometimes I stare at the computer screen or pace up and down and try to figure out what to do. But um, my most effective strategy is to take a break and do something else. And so maybe one advantage of having a few different things going at one time is that if I feel like I'm hitting writer's block with one project, I can shift to another one. Or if I can't write that day for whatever reason, then maybe I can think about some other kind of advocacy or organizing I'm doing.
Do you ever shut it down and just go, I'm out of here, I'm going for a walk, or I'm going to the gym, or I'm going to do something else? Does that
Oh
ever,
yeah. Oh, definitely.
what do you do to escape when things are like that?
Sometimes I go for a run, and that can clear my head. Sometimes I just read a book, about something else. Yeah, I'll have
Get
a
get
novel
out of the
going.
situation. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, just to clear my mind and get to think about something else for a little while.
You've lectured in 12 countries across 5 continents. How do perspectives on law and race differ internationally?
Oh, they differ in fascinating ways. I spent quite a bit of time in France as what was called an Equality of Opportunity Fellow, and the idea of the fellowship was for me to talk to people doing civil rights work, equality law work in France. And one of the things I found was that identical commitments, a commitment to equality of opportunity, for instance, might be pursued in very different ways that made sense given national history and national culture. And so that was a really fascinating thing to see the way that things I took for granted as an American would be seen as the wrong approach in another country. So, for instance, in France, there is a great deal of resistance to collecting data about race or having official recognitions of race. And so a lot of what we do in the American civil rights tradition is collect data to see where the disparities are, and then we'll know where the problems are. That seems to be the way to do it. My experience in France was that there are, committed, sincere people who believe very strongly that that's not the way to do it. That reinforces ideas of racial division. And although that's a position that I have been resistant to in the American context, I had to take it seriously and respect it in the French context. And so it made me think that there are a lot of different ways to approach the same issue.
As a founding member of the Academic Freedom Alliance, what do you see as the most pressing challenges to academic freedom today?
Well, they're coming, sadly, they're coming from many different directions today. When the Academic Freedom Alliance was started, I would have said that the main concern was a kind of groupthink on both the left and the right that made it difficult for unorthodox or heterodox thinkers to find a place. That on many issues there would be an immediate kind of polarization and a crystallization of a position or set of positions. And it was really hard to break out of that. If you're on the left, you need to toe this line. If you're on the right, toe that line. Today, I think the main threats to academic freedom, sadly, are coming from the government. We have, for the first time in my lifetime, a government that has sent out lists of banned words to organizations that are not to appear on websites or proposals for grants under the rubric of attacking what they describe as DEI, which is a very vague and undefined term. We have the suggestion that talking about the history of racial injustice, talking about the prevalence of gender inequality is unlawful, or will be met with the suspension of federal funding, and that even if it doesn't have formal consequences. I mean, even if the government doesn't follow through, has a real chilling effect. And I've already seen that in my own experience.
That's interesting. Your books have been selected as notable books of the year by the New York Times multiple times. What's your writing process like?
Well, I begin by developing a working hypothesis, and then I start to explore to test that hypothesis. Now, not in the sense of statistical testing, because I'm not a quantitative social scientist, but in the sense of looking broadly to see whether the historical record, the sociological accounts, and reported incidents line up with my intuitions about a particular social problem,
Mhm.
and then start writing. So I'll map out a vague idea of where I think the book is going to go. Now I have to admit it never goes exactly the way I think it's going to when I start writing. I've
Right.
got a plan, and then one has to be flexible depending on where both the evidence and the most interesting material is. But that's my basic writing process. I'm almost always reading and writing at the same time. I have a bunch of books out, and I'm, checking sources, and I'm looking at various things, and then I'll write a little bit and then go back to the books and for more inspiration and for more information.
Are you currently working on anything new, or do you have an idea for your next book?
I am actually working on a new book, and in a way, it was inspired by dress codes, but it's taking things in a slightly different direction. It's tentatively called The Virtues of Vice, and the idea of this book is to look at activities that have historically been condemned as vices. And I kind of got this from some of the issues around modesty and dress and the way that was considered to be a sinful vanity or a vice type behavior, but to look at some of these activities and see why it is people are engaging in them. Now, I don't want to argue in this book that it's good to engage in vices. That's not the point, but it is to try to figure out why it is, for instance, that someone might want to use mind-altering substances. Why are people drawn to gambling? Why are people drawn to illicit sex? And how is illicit sex defined? Because, of course, for much of European and American history, any sex outside of marriage was illicit. Certainly, until very recently, sex between people of the same sex was illicit. For a long time in American history, sex between people of different races was illicit. So looking at all of those, what were the political consequences of having these kind of ideas about vice? and who were the people who either resisted those ideas or transgressed, and is there anything we can learn from those people? That's basically the idea. I mean, the very early stages.
That's exciting. How long does it usually take? How long do you anticipate this taking, this next one?
I'm hoping this book takes a little bit less time than the last one. The last one probably took me about 5 years,
Oh, wow.
from concept to finished book. And I and my editor are both hoping that it will take more like 2 or 3 years.
Wow.
I think I've learned something from the last book in terms of how to streamline the process a little bit. But, again, you never know until you start to really dig into it.
How has your experience practicing law and working with various city governments informed your academic work?
It's given me one of the great things about the law and study of the law as compared to, let's say, the study of something like philosophy, which I've also long been very interested in, is that you're really dealing with practical, on the ground issues all the time. And so, what is plausible, a world of trade-offs and a world of practical constraints is very much in the foreground. And work in policy or with government is all about that. And so that is informed my work in a variety of ways because it's made me always foreground the question of practical constraints of real world situations and of the effects of ideas on real people in their day-to-day lives.
What would you tell your 20-year-old self?
Oh, huh. Um, what would I tell my 20-year-old self? I would probably tell him to um, spend a little bit less time at nightclubs and more time studying, and but also follow your passions.
I think that's wise advice. What advice would you give to law students who aspire to make an impact beyond traditional legal practice?
Ah. I would give them similar advice. Follow your passions, but look to ask yourself why you decided to go to law school and keep that at the center of your focus. That's what I would say. It's very easy to get distracted by what everyone else is doing, with the direction that you think the legal profession is headed, the jobs that are the most prestigious or that pay the most, and forget why you decided to go to law school in the first place as opposed to something else. But I think for people who can keep that initial passion in mind, even if the way they get there changes or the means change, that serves as a good lodestar.
What is your favorite quote or motto,
Oh,
or both?
um, huh. Let's see. There is this may or may not be my favorite, but it's just popped into my mind, and it's one that I like quite a lot. And I wish I could remember the exact quote and exactly who said it, but it's something like, I'll send you the exact quote later. Something like, opinions are like watches. Everyone's reads something different, and yet everyone trusts their own.
Oh, that's a good one. And what about a motto? Do you have one?
A motto. Um, I don't know if I have a motto. Let me
You got to get back to
get
me.
back to you with
Let's
that.
do another show on that. Is
Okay.
there anything that I've missed today that you want to share?
Um, no, I can't think of anything.
I think we've covered
I
everything.
think we've covered quite a lot. Yeah, you're a great interviewer. So
Oh,
you
well,
asked
thank
me a
you.
lot of probing questions.
Oh, thank you. Richard Thompson Ford, I cannot thank you enough for being here. It has been, I could chat with you all day. I'm going to have all your information in the show notes. I wish you the best of luck. I can't wait to hear about your next book, and I'm going to continue looking at the other book that you just finished. I think it's great. Thank you so much
Well,
for being here today. I appreciate
thank
it.
you so much. It's been delightful to talk to you.
Oh, thank you so much.
This has been I'm Too Busy with host Christina Flach. Tune in each week as Christina approaches the concept of success holistically, recognizing that achievement is not solely measured by financial triumphs, but also by maintaining a healthy work-life balance and focusing on self-care. Wednesdays, 7 p.m. Eastern on the Bold Brave TV network, powered by B2 Studios.